I know Fingerprints of the Gods you released in the 90s. It was
1995.
That's when I first read it, and I became obsessed. What motivated you to put that out?
It was a process, really. I used to be a current affairs journalist. I was the East Africa correspondent for The Economist. I had no interest in history whatsoever, but I began to come across things, particularly traveling initially in Ethiopia and then in Egypt, which made me wonder about the past. And, standing in front of the Great Pyramid of Egypt is an awe-inspiring experience, especially when you've never seen it before. And in 1989, when I first saw it, I had never seen it before. 6 million tons, 481 foot high, 13-acre footprint, this massive thing. And archaeologists are saying it's just the tomb of a pharaoh, and yet no pharaoh's body was ever found inside it, or indeed inside any ancient Egyptian pyramid. There had to be another explanation. And I've always been a contrarian. I've always tried to give an opposite point of view. I hate it when there's just a single narrative that says this is the truth and there is no other truth. And so I felt it was important to start giving an alternative point of view, and I started to look into it in depth. Could there be something missing from the story of our past? And that's why I ended up writing Fingerprints of the Gods, to put that information before the public, to allow people access to information that they had not had access to before, and to begin to think for themselves instead of just accepting the word of the so-called experts. The experts know a great deal. I couldn't do anything I do without the work that archaeologists do, but they shouldn't be given a monopoly over the story of the human past. Our past belongs to us. It belongs to all of us. And everybody, whether they're an academic or whether they're a man in the street, they've got something to contribute to the idea of our past.
And the Younger Dryas impact theory, when was that first brought out?
2007. That was when it first brought out. It immediately caught my eye because when I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods, I proposed that there had been a gigantic global cataclysm about 12,500 years ago, but I didn't really know what had caused it. I suggested a number of possibilities, and then suddenly in 2007, out comes this hypothesis with mainstream backing by mainstream scientists, saying that it looks like there was a series, not just one impact, but multiple impacts all over the Earth around 12,800 years ago that caused this cataclysm. And I began to follow that theory. And by about 2013, it became clear to me that these scientists were onto something really big. And I dived back into it and ended up writing another couple of books, Magicians of the Gods and America Before, which we talked about on your show back in 2019, just to try to put that information out there. And it's fascinating, really, very lazy, the way that archaeologists react to an alternative point of view. In my case, they almost never get to grips with the material that I've put out there in the books. They just say, oh, Hancock, he's a pseudoscientist. He's a fraud. He's a liar. But they never say why I'm a pseudoscientist, why I'm a fraud, or why I'm a liar. They just throw those words out, and you go to Wikipedia, and that's what you see. And the point about Wikipedia is that's the first place, if somebody hears my name or hears about my ideas, first place they're going to go have a look is Wikipedia. And immediately they're going to get turned off. And you can't edit my Wikipedia page. They've locked it, and it's controlled by a group of academics. So I do find this incredibly irritating. But the only thing to do is to keep on going. And this is why, frankly, Joe, your show has been so important, because you're one of the very few people who's allowed this information to get out to the general public, this contrary information which the mainstream doesn't want to hear. You're a powerful platform that's allowed this information to reach so many more people than it otherwise would have reached, and I'm grateful to you for that.
Well, I'm grateful to you guys. I'm really grateful, because it's such an exciting notion. It's such an exciting idea, and it makes sense when you look at these incredible structures that we don't really have an explanation for. Mm-hmm. And when we think about the conventional dating of modern history and modern civilization, they want to put it at around 6,000-ish years ago.
That's right. That's right. And then, that was the view really for decades, that civilization began about 6,000 years ago. And before that, there was no such thing as civilization. And they say that the first big megalithic structures were created by societies that were already agricultural societies. So they were generating surpluses, which allowed specialists to have the time to learn how to be architects and engineers and builders. But then suddenly, out of the blue, and we've got an episode on this in the series, comes Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which is 11,600 years old. It's 5,000 years old than the supposed oldest megalithic structures, and it's a fucking enormous megalithic structure, probably the biggest megalithic structure on Earth, because so much of it is still underground, although we know what's there because of ground-penetrating radar. Highly sophisticated, 20-ton pillars, beautiful astronomical alignments. Buried, deliberately buried by the people who created it. They ran it for about 1,000 years, and then they deliberately buried it. And archaeology is still struggling to explain this. They've now had to say, well, okay, somehow megalithic architecture began thousands of years before we thought it began. How are we going to explain this? And they have to accept, this is one of the mysteries of Göbekli Tepe, that the archaeology does show this quite clearly, that when the work began on Göbekli Tepe 11,600 years ago, the entire population there were hunter-gatherers. They were not agriculturalists, generating those supposed surpluses that would allow experts in architecture to emerge. They were hunter-gatherers. And how, in God's name, do a group of hunter-gatherers wake up one morning and create something like this enormous scale? And then the mystery deepens, because at the same time that they're building the megalithic site, they're also suddenly doing agriculture. And I look at that as a contrarian. And I say, I actually don't think that this was something that was just dreamed up overnight by a group of hunter-gatherers. I think I'm looking at a transfer of technology. I think people came to that site who already knew how to do this stuff. And maybe they used that site to mobilize the local population, to push them into a new direction. And that was truly the beginnings of civilization as we know it. But I think it was a restarting of civilization, a reboot, not the actual beginnings. I think there was an earlier lost civilization. And that's the whole point of the show I've made.
One should mention about that particular date, 11,600.
Well, it's incredibly important. It's an incredibly important date because the Younger Dryas begins 12,800 years ago with a cataclysm, with a puzzling, mysterious rise in sea level at the same point. 1,000 years of freezing temperatures, mass extinctions of animal species all over the world. And then 11,600 years ago, global temperature shoots up. The last of the ice caps collapse into the sea. Sea level rises enormously. That is the date that work starts at Göbekli Tepe. And it's a point I've made many times, but it's really worth making because archaeologists roll their eyes every time you say the word Atlantis. But that is precisely the date that Plato, which is the earliest surviving reference to Atlantis, that's precisely the date he gives for the destruction of Atlantis, 11,600 years before our time. He puts it this way, that his ancestor Solon visited Egypt, and we know about that visit. It's historically recorded. That visit to Egypt was in 600 BC.